think of taking a sip of water from this water bottle. Now think of a universe, okay, just in your imagination where you cannot live, all right, without taking a sip from this water every, I don't know, say 10, 20 seconds, right? But here's the thing. You're so accustomed to it. All right, you're so accustomed to taking a sip of water every 5, 10 seconds since you were born, the same way that we think of, blinking, if you will, that you start to think to yourself, hold on, what if we broaden our perception and we try and find a way to live without needing to take this sip of water every 5 to 10 seconds? Now you might be saying, okay, Dave, why are you bringing this up? Why are you even giving that example? Well, folks, first off, I just want to say welcome back to another episode of Let's Get Banned. Today's episode is called, just give me one quick second, I just have to catch up here. It is called Fractal Patterns, Susan Go's PSYOP on Ufology, Why Gravitational Lensing is Ignored, and Anderson Cooper is CIA. You're going to see how all of this comes full circle. Excuse me. Now, again, think about that example of what I said about drinking the water bottle, right? That is exactly the same apparatus in which is what is applied to fractals or fractal patterns. Why do I say that? Because fractal patterns in general, they're found within artificial structures, they're found within the way that we think, they're found within nature. Okay, and they're found within the universal composition of study in which, for example, NASA or other agencies and institutions, private or public, tend to find reoccurrence in relative to their research. Now, let's take a look here at fractalfoundation.org. A fractal is a never-ending pattern. Fractals are infinitely complex patterns that are self-similar across different scales. They are created by repeating a simple process over and over in an ongoing feedback loop. Driven by recursion, fractals are images of dynamic systems, the pictures of chaos. Geometrically, they exist in between our familiar dimensions. Fractal patterns are extremely familiar since nature is full of fractals. For instance, trees, rivers, coastlines, mountains, clouds, seashells, hurricanes, etc. Abstract fractals, such as the Mandelbrot set, can be generated by a computer calculating a simple equation over and over, end quote. Now, the reason I bring this up, folks, is because we see right here a phenomenal example of a visualization or visual perspective, of the way in which fractal patterns seem to be occurring. And also, by the way, too, if you take a look at the way in which we as humans think, okay, and the way that we, for example, if you're in the military and you're taught to compartmentalize or what have you, and you're part of a psychological operations unit or division or platoon, what have you, the same apparatuses and methods of thought are applied in our way of thinking. Now, try and think about how we can break free of the fractal pattern. It's kind of interesting because you can't. Why? How do we know that you can't? Or at least how do we think we know we cannot? Because even thinking about breaking free of the fractal patterns is using a fractal pattern neurological visualization or form of manifestations to connect those dots. And one last example is if you take a look at terrorist groups or organized crime, if you take a look at the web of connections relative to the social structure, you have the boss, the underboss, then the captain, then the foot soldier, then the associate in organized crime, and then in terrorism you have the leader, and then you have the counselor, all these different positions, if you will, right? Not saying that that's exclusively the case, but the point is that it cannot be broken down simply because it is the composition of which our form of esoteric thinking relative to the 0-point field is perceived. Now, let's take a look at this right over here. News.globallandscapesforum.org, not exactly a mainstream media website. The fractal nature of almost all things. Understanding nature's fractals from galaxies to ecosystems to the human heartbeat. Again, in finance too. Fractal patterns are constantly used, and I quote, or look at a tree. Ideally, if your environment allows, when it is bare. Look at how the trunk leads up to a branch that splits off into more branches, then smaller branches, and finally branches so small that they appear to be scratches in the sky. This, again, is the self-repeating, slightly imperfect pattern of a fractal. If your trees are leaved, look at the leaves, and you will notice the same patterns in the veins, right? Very similar to human veins, very similar to, in general, I guess, even snowflakes, if you want to call it that. But take a look at this. The term fractal was coined by Polish-born mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, rooted in the Latin word fractus, which means broken glass, the reference being to broken lines. In the 1980s, while working at IBM, Mandelbrot arose as a singular pioneer into the fractal universe, publishing the seminal work, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, which laid the mathematical and philosophical foundation for fractal theories that have since been adopted by analysts, scientists, and theoreticians from all disciplines, from art to astrophysics, economics to the natural sciences, social media to medicine, and climatology to human psychology. All right, end quote. here's the thing. First off, why hasn't there been an agency or institution looking into this on the surface level of academia? Because this is ultimately very, very revealing, and we find this to be the case not just within math. I mean, okay, we have fractal mathematics, we have fractal physics, but there's fractal art, even fractal philosophy, again, having to do with the concept of not just exclusive to this case, but as an anecdotal example, the concept of visualization relative to the way in which the mind is structured and works. Now, look at this right here. TechRadar.com. Is the human mind made of fractals? Our thoughts may have their own form of geometry. Interestingly enough, the biological nature, and I quote, of human thought is one of the brain's greatest secrets, especially as our thinking climbs into higher levels of abstraction. But according to a newly published study, we might at least be able to see the outlines of what it looks like, and it's surprisingly familiar. The paper published today in the journal Nature Communications, comes from a research team at Dartmouth who approached the intricate network of human neurons from which thought arises as analogous to the mathematical idea of a fractal, a geometric shape that looks similar no matter how you scale it. Again, before I go on, end quote, the same way in which we visualize solving a problem, the same way in which we visualize, okay, if I have to drive my car from here to there, what do I do? And I quote, to generate our thoughts, our brains create this amazing lightning storm of connection patterns, said Jeremy R. Manning, an assistant professor at Psychological and Brain Sciences, director of the Contextual Dynamics Lab at Dartmouth, and the paper's senior author. Before I go on, I just want to say very quickly, Dartmouth, I'm not saying these individuals specifically. I don't mean to defame them or I guess you could say slander them in any way, shape, or form, but the institutions at Dartmouth, particularly within this, I guess you could say, area, have been known to be quite compartmentalized and have had very interesting, allegedly, contractors, no-name contractors walking in and out of there constantly. Anyways, the patterns look beautiful, but they are also incredibly complicated. Our mathematical framework lets us quantify how those patterns relate at different scales and how they change over time. End quote. What I find so peculiar and so phenomenal about this, folks, is that when you take a look at the way in which different operations are conducted from an intelligence perspective, they use a fractal component. Now, here's the thing. When we take a look over here at how it says, our brains create this amazing lightning storm of connection patterns, end quote. Notice something. This could be, spoken of, anecdotally, metaphorically, you name it, right? However, it could also mean literally due to the fact that, again, members will know this quite significantly more so than the public probably, but pertaining to removing the VMAT2 gene. There's a geometrical insurgence there in which there is a gap between the esoteric aspect of a certain subatomic structure of a neuron and that of the literal scientific, I guess, biological relation in which there is a connection, but there is something in between that connection. Now, I'd like to take some notes from a recent live stream that Lou Elizondo did, and again, think of him what you will, but I want to make this connection very quickly. Mr. Elizondo says, okay, he made a very good point too. I have to be honest, whether you guys agree with him or not, or like him or not, just like with Stephen Greer, we have to think, and it's unfortunate that there's at this point even such a polarization within the community, but anyways, that's for another time. If we take a look here, Mr. Elizondo said, flying is a fundamental understanding of these four forces: thrust, lift, drag, and weight, okay? And at the same time, magnetism, we know for a fact, has opposites in polarity. We know this based on science. I'm not making this up. This is nothing new per se. I just want to be very, very clear about that, okay? And the reason I say that is this. You know how we've talked about how UFOs are sort of create a vacuum bubble around them, or they sort of access the sort of electrical universe ether just around the small vicinity of their craft, and then everything irrespective of them is still moving and proceeding in a linear fashion relative to how we perceive it? Okay. Mr. Elizondo was trying to explain on this live stream the way in which these craft may not even fly. They simply create a vacuum around them that voids them of space and time. Why do I bring this up? It's the same concept, all right, in the way in which the UFOs, say this is a UFO, this right here, my hand is a UFO. It's now creating a small layer around it that accesses sort of the electric universe or ether realm. I'm not saying electric universe theory is correct, but at this point in time, my research leads me to believe that very substantially and very strongly, but I'm open to having my mind changed. So we have this pen acting as this sort of form of energy around the craft, right? What if, for example, based on what we're seeing here of the fractal patterns and lightning storms of connections, that's the same apparatus or same form of energy that creates that surgence and mergence between the esoteric realm and that of the biological neuron? You see what I'm saying here? And how do we know this? Well, let's take a look at psychologytoday.com. Fractal brains, fractal thoughts. Our brains are fractal with far-reaching branches. Okay? Take a look at this right here. Researchers from the University of Cambridge, and I quote, took a big step forward this year in understanding how our brains work. It seems that the brain has a fractal organization. This likely gives us much of what we consider human. All right. And at a deeper level, these findings may help to connect us in a very fundamental way to the rest of the natural world. Now, before I go on, I just want to say one thing. We could argue very strongly that this is applied in almost every aspect of life, if not every aspect. And the mind control grid and the different forms of energetic suppression and oppression in which we're living under is what's preventing us from creating a sort of fractal consciousness network, or we can argue very strongly a sort of hive mind network. But take a look at this right here. The design, results, and context for this study are very sophisticated, and the implications are quite abstract, so I'm going to do my best to be clear. Okay, now take a look at this, and I quote, "You may quickly recognize that many other natural structures besides trees are fractals: neurons, rivers, the respiratory system, the circulatory system, geological fault lines, snow lakes, and so on." All right, why do systems do this? Essentially, fractal systems have many opportunities for growth, change, and reorganization, yet they are also very robust. They maintain their coherence. They hold together well even under tough circumstances. They're balanced in this respect between order and chaos. They are simple yet also very complex. End quote. As above, so below. You cannot have one without the other. Similar to what I just said, referencing Mr. Elizondo saying magnetism has opposites in polarity, and we know this. Okay, now, interestingly enough, if we jump back to the very beginning and the visualization of this, you see this little animation right here. I believe this to be a phenomenal representation. Although it seems, some call it an eye trip or an illusion or a mind trip, if you will. This simply reminds me of the infinity symbol. You see what I'm saying here, folks? The constant reoccurrence and cyclical apparatus. Now, here's what I want to bring up pertaining to, again, Susan Go and many different forms of, I guess you could say, the UAP, OSAP, ATIP phenomenon, if you will. Let's take a look at this right here. Dr. James Lukatsky, OSAP program manager's career ruined. All right. In a blog posted May 1st, 2018, entitled ATIP or OSA, or was supposed to be OSAP, I believe, I wrote in part about those Defense Intelligence Reference Documents, or DIRDs, which had been circulating on the internet since December 2017. Each of the three available DIRDs made mention of the fact that the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Applications Program, OSAP, program manager at the Defense Intelligence Agency, at the DIA, was one James T. Lukatsky, D. English. Okay, end quote. This is according to scientific research, UFOs-scientificresearch.blogspot.com. I undertook some research into who James Lukatsky was and wrote up my then findings in the May 1st, 2018 blog. Since then, I've also been able to find out a little bit more about him. To recap, I found that his full name was James Thomas Lukatsky, with a date of birth of January 9th, 1951. Okay, between 1984 and 1986, he was a joint author of a number of technical papers about plasma engineering studies in torsatron reactors. In 1986, he was an engineer assistant, in the nuclear design section of Duke Power Company, responsible for reactor core design, startup and operating predictions, and plant support. Okay. In August 2008, he was designated as the core and government project leader in the DIA's OSAP solicitation number. In 2009, the DIA's own internal magazine, Communique, showed him as celebrating 10 years federal service. In August 2016, he attended an energy conference and listed a DIA email address as his contact details. Okay. I located details showing that his wife, Wizal Abu Lukatsky, pardon me, Abuo if I mispronounced her name, had worked for NASA at least around 1997. All right? Then, that is a summary of publicly available information about James Lukatsky. Now, here's the unfortunate thing. All right? End quote. Mr. Lukatsky's career has been destroyed based on the different things in which have occurred. Due to this right here, let me just read it, okay? And I quote, UAP has even been associated with demons and anti-Judeo-Christian beliefs, okay? On November 1st, 2018, to the Stars Academy website blog featured a blog post by Lou Elizondo, all right? Part of this blog post provides some new information about James Lukatsky, although Elizondo again does not name him. I experienced this firsthand during my time working at the U.S. government's ATIP program, where certain senior government officials thought our collection of facts on UAPs was dangerous to their philosophical beliefs. Again, Collins elite, that small element within the government, within the Department of Defense, that believes everything and anything pertaining to these anomalies and different aliens and different interdimensional entities are demonic. Again, define demonic. I believe some could be the case. case, but in others not so much. Now, I apologize if I'm boring you folks, but I promise you in about a minute this is going to go full circle. In fact, my ATIP predecessor's career was ruined because of misplaced fear by an elite few. Rather than accept the data as provided by a top-ranked rocket scientist, they decided the data was a threat to their belief system and instead destroyed his career because of it. This is a very end quote. This is a very interesting statement by Elizondo and goes a long way to explaining why Lakatsky has not appeared in the public realm discussing his knowledge of the program and topic, end quote. Now, here's what's interesting. For those that are familiar with the Black Vault, with UFOs and all that, and for those that are familiar with the FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, particularly within the UFO community, you folks are going to find something, and if not, you already know. A woman by the name of Susan Go. And I'm going to be honest with you folks. I don't care if this video gets removed. For I guess you could say, I don't know about doxing her. Doxing essentially means, providing her personal information online. I'm not going to do that. But I want to say something. She is the reason why a lot of this crap is not coming out. She is working on behalf of a handful of individuals that have completely gone rogue within the government for a handful of years, for many, many years really, which we could argue have a direct branch or connection to Majestic 12 and or Zodiac. She wrote a paper here, okay, having to do with the Psychological Operations Department. Now, for those who want to know what she looks like, this is what she looks like right here. She has a Pinterest cooking page, if you want to call it. This woman right here, folks, again, as you know, I never single-handedly point an individual out and try to appear like I'm bashing them. But I would dare to argue, this woman right here, and her superiors, it's not just her, let me be clear, is one of the sole reasons why we keep getting, pardon my English, fucked with when it comes to the Freedom of Information Act pertaining to UFOs. Well, how do I know this? Look, theblackvault.com. Pentagon destroyed emails of former intelligence official tied to UFO investigation claims. If we jump on over here, this is exonews.org. If you go to DuckDuckGo and you try to type in Susan Go on Exo News, guess what? Oops, can't be found. Oh my. Interesting, isn't it? Take a look, hotair.com. Pentagon deletes all emails of former ATIP director. Unidentified.net. The Pentagon Public Affairs Office have been interfering with UAP FOIA requests and lying about UAP, ATIP, and Elizondo. Again, who's been doing all of this? It's Susan Go, and I quote, as reported last year by Silva Record and the Unidentified, and thanks to obtained emails by researcher Dean Johnson, it was revealed in 2020 that Pentagon spokesperson Susan Go was coordinating unclassified FOIA UAP requests to come through herself, which, for an official who isn't an appointed FOIA officer, arguably is a very serious action, in fact, highly immoral, if not illegal, end quote. Here's the thing. Okay, I encourage you folks, and I never normally do this, to somehow find a way to reach out to her if you can, because I'm going to do this myself. By the way, I'm not trying to be like some big advocate or what have you here, but she is the sole reason. She is the sole reason why a lot of these revelations have not come out. The pressure needs to be put on them. What can I say? The pressure needs to be put on them. Anyways, she writes this paper having to do with psychological operations, okay? Now, the reason why I want to bring this up is because this just goes to show the way in which there are so many different apparatuses that tend to involve the different, I guess you could say, ways of fractal thinking, but also the forms of cover-ups. Take a look. And this is, by the way, a multi-page report. Department of Defense, and I quote, this is written by Susan Go. Department of Defense also needs to formally establish a DoD Committee on Strategic Influence, as has been done several times in the past. The officers and officials within JCS and OSD do a good job of communicating and coordinating among themselves. However, formalization lends legitimacy and gets attention. Flag officers and senior official officers do not perceive ad hoc groups and meetings as being important compared to committee meetings, which the Secretary of Defense or the USDP has declared will occur. One area that the administration should address immediately is the distrust and antipathy of the military by other departments involved in strategic influence. Now, this is the key thing right here, folks. This opens up a whole can of worms, and it's right in front of our faces. PSB was based on the false premise that you could separate psychological strategy from national strategy. Equally fallacious in today's world of instant worldwide communications is the notion that you can separate military psychological activities from public affairs and public diplomacy. There's a prevailing misconception in the State Department and public affairs field that military psychological operations are not truthful, and that contact with PSYOP will somehow taint public affairs and public diplomacy. While there are valid reasons for keeping the messages and activities separated in the eyes of foreign audiences, those reasons do not apply to coordination at the U.S. national level. Again, end quote. Very fancy words, but I want you folks to keep this in mind. PSB, all right, was based on the false premise that you could separate this was just a sort of, I guess you could say, a committee or team, if you will, PSB, but on the false premise that you could separate psychological strategy from national strategy. Do you see what she's saying right there? The dissemination of the information or news from the mainstream media, you can't tell the difference between that and what the military-industrial complex is emitting through the news and into the public within the West and within Europe relative to NATO's overarching influence and control compared to that of a psychological operation. We don't know the difference. She says it right there blatantly. I mean, okay, maybe in fancy terms, but essentially this furthers the thing, which we could say, technically speaking, goes back to when Joe Rogan had Sanjay Gupta on the other day. And Joe Rogan said to Sanjay Gupta, listen, ultimately, when you take a look, if they're lying about a comedian taking horse dewormer, how can we trust them on Russia or Syria? Again, I'm not saying that legitimate reporting does not occur within the media, but the point I'm trying to say here is this. There is even sometimes the mainstream media outlets, they're not innocent, don't get me wrong, but even sometimes they themselves don't know that they're being fed bullshit, pardon my English. The point is this, there is a fractal reoccurrence constantly appearing here. Now, if we take a look at Susan Go's emails, okay, look at this, and I quote, "One other thing you need to do is reach out to the Air Force's FOIA office. We need to keep a very, very close eye on FOIA requests for release of UAP videos to ensure consistency of what does and doesn't get released. Generally, so far, at least with Navy vids, we're not releasing them. Per our conversation, here is the query we received from the drive. Understand that we need to coordinate our queries with you before we respond, so you can ensure that we are not unintentionally saying something different than the Navy or other services." End quote. So in other words, basically, we need to make sure that our bullshit is on the same page. That's essentially what it is, right? I mean, I don't know how else we can describe this, how else we can define this in any other way. Okay, now, you might be saying, Dave, what does this have to do with anything? Well, let's take a look at this right over here. TheGrayZone.com. Vanderbilt oligarch heir Anderson Cooper worked at CIA in college. CNN and 60 Minutes host Anderson Cooper, a scion of the Vanderbilt oligarch dynasty, worked in CIA headquarters for 2 summers. Anderson Cooper sits at the height of the U.S. corporate media. By the way, he is his mother's a Vanderbilt and all that. But anyways, the 60 Minutes feature was hosted by Anderson Cooper, who pressured Sanders to denounce Fidel Castro and stressed there's a lot of dissidents imprisoned in Cuba. Okay, the exchange with Sanders set off a firestorm of attacks on the Vermont senator, with campaign rivals and bipartisan cast of pundits slamming him for his mild defense of Cuba's gains in literacy. But Cooper and his red-baiting performance remained above scrutiny. Okay, the media's favorite silver fox hails from one of the most powerful families in human history. He is the son of oligarch Gloria Vanderbilt, and his great-great-great-grandfather was Cornelius Vanderbilt, a prototypical American robber baron who had in fact helped lead a bungling imperial plot to build a canal through Nicaragua during the 1850s. End quote. By the way, for those who don't know, that same canal was allegedly used during Iran-Contra, under Reagan during the 80s and all that, but that's for a different time as well. But, that connects to Epstein and so many other things too. With that being said, the point I'm trying to make here, folks, is that if we follow the apparatus of the social structure in a way there is a fractal pattern reoccurring consistently, what we're going to find is that whether it's Susan Go, whether it's Anderson Cooper, it has to do with the example I gave at the beginning pertaining to the way in which we view organized crime families, if you want to call it, whether it's Italian, Russian, Chinese, you name it, right? Or whether it's viewing terrorist cells. I'm not trying to equate Anderson Cooper and Susan Go to a terrorist cell or organized crime, but what I'm trying to say is the structure in which there is a dissemination of propaganda to cover up for multiple angles of a multi-pronged, multifaceted apparatus from the media is right in front of our eyes. And we see it because Mrs. Go writes it in one of her papers. She writes it in one of her papers, right? Now, here's the thing that I want to bring up quite substantially as well, too, having to do with gravitational lens, all right, or gravitational lensing and the perspectives in which are brought ultimately to this I guess you could say, conversation, if you will. Look at this, and I quote, "A gravitational lens is a distribution of matter, such as a cluster of galaxies, between a distant light source and an observer that is capable of bending the light from the source as the light travels towards the observer. The effect is known as gravitational lensing, and the amount of bending is one of the predictions of Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity. Classical physics also predicts the bending of light, but only half of that predicted by general relativity. Although Einstein made unpublished calculations on the subject in 1912, Orest Kolfsin 1924, and František Link 1936 are generally credited with being the first to discuss the effect in print. Okay? However, the effect is more commonly associated with Einstein, who published an article on the subject in 1936. Fritz Zwicky proposed or posited in 1937 that the effect could allow galaxy clusters to act as gravitational lenses. It was not until 1979 that this effect was confirmed by observation of the so-called twin QSO SBS 0957 plus 561. End quote. Okay. Again, take a look at this. General relativity. Now, what happens if you can pull, for example, that fabric or that fabric of space-time to you, irrespective of everybody else? We've been talking about this. Gravitational lensing. Its perspective from us, if we were the ones inside of a craft, for example, all right, would be that we haven't moved. But everybody else would see us as moving quickly to the point where it's like, are they teleporting? Are they going at light speed? The reason why I'm bringing this up, folks, is because do you see how the mainstream media and how the public academia of things has not looked into all of this, in the sense that they say, well, we know about gravitational lens. Look, it's in Einstein's theory of general relativity. I don't know what else there is to do with regards to it. Again, there is a form of suppression that is right at that threshold. And it's people like Susan Go. It's people like Anderson Cooper that continue to push and push to the point where that threshold gets lower and lower. And we need to very quickly and very strongly push against that, if you ask me. Okay, and now let's take a look at this from reddit.com. This is in the r/alien subreddit. This has to do with gravitational lensing. Please don't think I'm crazy. We saw what I can only describe as the creature from the Predator movies in San Bernardino National Forest. Again, national parks, national forests. I mean, what a coincidence. Hey, for those that know what I'm talking about. But anyways, this person provides the coordinates and all of that. Now, take a look at this right here. Friday, we were making our way to Clark Summit. As we were walking, we noticed that we were veering off the trail. I asked my friend in front of me why he was going off the trail, and he asked our friend who was in front of him the same thing. The friend in front told us, I can hear a woman talking. You guys don't hear that? We didn't hear anything. We tried to convince her to let it be because it was already kind of dark. End quote. Before I go on, I'm not going to read the whole thing. The point is that this is already letting them off the beaten path, but it is harnessing, okay, the fractal way in which I gave the example of drinking the water bottle at the beginning, the fractal way in which our brains and minds think relative to the patterns that are executed in a physical sense, in a verbal sense, even in an esoteric sense, excuse me. Okay, now look at this right here. And I quote, okay, I get a bit spooked now because she's absolutely serious, and we absolutely could not hear whatever she was hearing. They started to hear this woman yell. Here's where it got weird. We only ventured off the trail about 300-400 meters, yet at one point we were completely lost. Again, potentially a pocket dimension. Here's the thing. We don't have any fancy gear or GPS stuff because we've never needed it, but we've been on this trail enough to know that we hadn't gone far, yet we couldn't find the trail in any direction after walking for about 15 to 20 minutes. I started to feel weird, kind of dizzy and lightheaded, and when I mentioned this, the other two said they felt weird as well. End quote. Again, pocket dimension. When people say, Project Bluebeam, could this be an example of an extremely advanced holographic substrate, that's created a pocket dimension using that same vacuum? When I said earlier about the vacuum type of energy that is accessible via the ether realm, which is all around us, within the VMAT2 gene, within the same type of energy that goes around, just around the edge of the craft of some of these extraterrestrials, or maybe most of them. Right? Now, interestingly enough, what if that happened within a certain vicinity in a geographical location? And it's possible because if we take a look at this right over here, this is from the Journal of Geophysical Research, Atmospheres, Nanodust Shedding and its Potential Influence on Dust-Related Phenomena in the Mesosphere. Okay? Noctilucent clouds, NLCs, and the polar mesospheric summer echoes are optical and radio features, respectively, appearing in the summer polar mesosphere of altitudes of 80 to 90 kilometers. Now, the NLC/PMSC dust particles consist mostly of water ice, but also contain atomic and molecular meteoric material injected into the upper mesosphere by ablating micrometeoroids. End quote. Okay? Sorry, let me say one last thing. Dust particles can have a profound influence on the charge balance in the mesosphere, end quote. Now, going back to before, Mr. Elizondo said, which is just science. It's not like, it's just what he says or believes. Magnetism has opposites in polarity. Very similar, right? Now, very relative, excuse me. If we could apply this type of method and apparatus to that in which this person was experiencing relative to everything that we've just discussed, fractal thinking, all right, the way in which Miss Go is suppressing the technology that can open the door to explain how people experience these types of things. I mean, at this point, it's pretty clear. It's right in front of us. If I'm being completely honest with you folks, I'm not just saying that to say it. Okay, so again, at the end, I really don't know what else could be said with respects to this. I mean, we take a look at the way in which this is just very clear, very right in front of our face. I mean, look at this right here. BBC.com, August 5th, 2010. 11 years ago. Churchill ordered UFO cover-up, National Archives show. Again, I don't mean to read through all of this, but you see what I'm saying here, folks? What we're seeing here, again, is just so many cases where it's right in front of our faces. And we see the clear evidential cover-up of these different ways. And they're taking advantage of the way in which we think because they know that we think in a fractal form. I mean, for crying out loud, you have Susan Go, who's not even in charge of the FOIA requests and all that, who's potentially illegally covering up for UAP videos and all that, that is taking advantage of the fractal thinking of psychological operations, as she wrote in her own paper. So again, power cannot help but like to show how powerful it is, whether we know it subconsciously or not. That even applies to people like you and me. You know, maybe a little bit of a bad example, but say you get into a street fight with somebody and you end up winning that fight. You can't, whether you started the fight or not is a different story, but let's just say you didn't start the fight, you were just defending yourself, you ended up winning, the police came and that person got arrested for doing what they did to you, but you still won the fight. You're going to go home and tell your partner, hey, I won the fight. It's the same example. Power cannot help but show how powerful power is. With that being said, folks, I apologize if I seemed a little bit all over the place, but let me know what you think, and we'll catch all of you very, very soon. Cheers.